but I think I'll just begin introductions first. Hi everyone, welcome to the semi-finals of SEP 2023. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far. My name is Kuhan and I'm your chair for this round. Judging with me, my panelists, I think you can introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, my name is hardship today. All the best.
Hi everyone, Toby. Good luck.
Hi everyone, my name is Beatrice Pizon. Congratulations for making it.
Okay, thank you very much. We're just waiting for Taki and then we can just begin once. Sorry. We're doing the second motion. The veto for Gulf is the first motion, veto for Op is the third motion. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister. Here you
go. Checking if I'm audible, clearly. Go by him pronouns. Happy to take a point whenever. Follow us for a life of prosperity. Follow us for a life of stability. This was what the Japanese posters wrote before they committed the rape of Nanking. This was what the Japanese have said before they colonized the entirety of Southeast Asia and sent everyone to the mines and railroad tracks. It's the naiveness on opposition to be able to support and align themselves with the principally abhorrent actor in the point of the 1940s is what loses them the debate at all. Three pieces of setup before I move to my two arguments. Firstly, let's explain the power dynamic between the MPAJA and the Japanese army in terms of the Japanese occupation. Then, what does the MPAJA look like? Apart from it being the anti-Japanese army, I think it also means to say that they engage in terms of guerrilla warfare as inherently opposition towards any type of occupation that the Japanese have had. They were the only militant body substantial enough to be able to launch a counter-offensive against the Japanese army at the time for a few reasons. The first, it was led by the Party Communist of Malaya, which was kind of the most predominant militant political party at that point in time. It also means they had opted from a majority of anti-Japanese sentiments that was universal within Malaya at the time that transcends racial boundaries and cultural lines. It also meant that the British, oftentimes after leaving the blitzkrieg attack by the Japanese, were still able to fund proxy warfare during the Malayan Peninsula by supplying them weapons and supplying them commandos who were able to strategize their military operations as well. In comparison to the Japanese occupation is that although they were able to control discretionary power and a totalitarian regime within the Malayan Peninsula, they did not have the universal acceptance of the individuals on the ground. Likely the public sentiment was overwhelmingly against it then. Secondly, what would this individual do on the other side of the house? Likely by joining the MPAJA, it means that their skills will be utilized on a case-by-case basis. So if you're a young and upcoming individual, likely you'll join the offensive army. If you're a person who doesn't really have the physical capacity, you become an informant, or you're able to supply and secure positions of MPAJA fighters within your village. Likely we are also able to gain reciprocal military protection from the army itself then. Lastly, what does the debate operate on? We think the trade-off is simple. In order for you to actually have a model on this side of opposition, for you to trade off information to the Japanese army, it also means sacrificing the security of your villagers, sacrificing the security of individuals who are fighting the anti-Japanese fight within your own communities, and this is the trade-off that opposition has to take that we say is absolutely unfair. Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, on why the opposition to Japanese occupation is at the forefront of this individual's mental calculus at that point in time. Three layers to this. Firstly, let's talk about the imposition of Japanese rule being the most morally abhorrent act that anyone could support at that point in time, and why is it that likely this individual would also be affected by this. We have two structural reasons for this. The first is on the inherent nature of Japanese occupation that all of us have been familiar with. The fact is that they've killed and imposed terror onto everyone within the Malayan Peninsula, that they forced men to go build railroads and be able to work within plantations just to grow their economy. They sent women to become comfort women for the Japanese soldiers. They have built and crumbled the entire Malayan economy at that point in time for just fill their own selfish colonialist interests at that point in time. Likely, you also grew up in a change where the social fabric of your entire community is uprooted by the Japanese occupation and entirely shifted against your interests. If you were a person living at that point in time, the hatred and the amount of anti-Japanese sentiment you would likely build up over the 3 years and 8 months the Japanese were there, sufficient and were tantamount enough for you to make that decision to oppose the Japanese. But likely also on the nature of the MPAJA. Given that it was led by the Communist Party of Malaya at that point in time, it was predominantly Chinese-centric. The fact is that you were able to actually make that decision to begin to whether or not you wanted to opt into the MPAJA likely would mean that the anti-Han sentiment that the Japanese propagated throughout their occupation in the Asia Pacific would likely affect you as well. But here's the sentiment on proposition that shows why this person would likely care about it. It's the fact that your involvement within your community and to be exposed to the similar sentiment that was opposition to the Japanese were likely going to affect you as an individual at that point in time, given that your community overwhelmingly supported them. The second layer proves why the fear and guilt we will have after leaking this information will likely affect you as well. Ultimately, the reaction that the Japanese would have towards the information that you leak with them is quite unpredictable. The fact is that the Japanese are fighting a guerrilla warfare and a guerrilla party. In order for them to actually uproot the power structure that they have within these communities, oftentimes it involves the non-discriminate killings of individuals or the non-discriminate uprooting of villages entirely. This means to say even if we were able to leak information about one specific family within your village that is involved in the MPAJA, likely other communities, even your own family, would also be caught in the crossfires in Japanese trying to uproot entire villages thus to prevent it from rising again. The harm is that I think the guilt that you have living knowing that the enemy is likely going to kill off everyone within your village, or the fear that your own family might be caught in the crossfire, is exactly why you would not leak this information as a person. Lastly, why is the MPAJA far better fits our sentiment then? Obviously, it's because the proximity that you have. It's not just cultural proximity that you have as a local Malayan, but also in terms of the lived experience that you have. The people fighting in the MPAJA are the brothers that you grew up with as a child. You shared dinner, you shared families, all the bonds that goes through transcends any form of blood and any form of cultural ties. It becomes a sense of brotherhood that you will not sacrifice and trade off any person to do so. If opposition first would like to trade off 2 of their other speakers for the Japanese army, I wouldn't think they would do so then. The fact is that we're able to align ourselves with the moral high ground as well. You are exposed to the same type of anti-Japanese sentiment that the MPAJA would likely propagate in terms of propaganda. Likely they would also tell you to be the most morally high ground person in this case, by telling you to not sacrifice yourself to the Japanese then. I think you'll also buy into it because the propaganda that you are exposed to is more proximate. I'll take that point.
So when are the Japanese more likely to do indiscriminate killings, even of your family members? When they have information, when they don't have information, only suspicion?
So obviously whether or not you are able to have, that's the point, is the fact that even if the Japanese army still had information, they would still non-discriminately kill, because that's the point of it. They want to uproot the entire power structure within that region itself. You need to prove why they wouldn't then on your side of the house. Second argument shows why we ensure self-protection and safety of your loved ones. The first point is explaining the power of the MPAJA, how it's able to guarantee security on your side of the house. We identify 3 reasons. The first is on the basis of its cultural and communal base. It's the fact that you have public support on the ground against the Japanese. Likely it means to say that firstly you have loyalty. That means to say you won't be backstabbed by other people within that organization. Secondly, it also means in terms of mobility. If your security of your identity is spread out within this region, other people in the MPAJA, like south of Malaya, were able to bring you there so that you can be protected and safeguarded then in this case. Secondly, it's also on the underground nature of the MPAJA. Likely, the Infoslide only mentions that it's an underground organization where the Japanese doesn't have information. That means to say there are multiple plans that the MPAJA are able to actually deliver to counter-offense the Japanese army, to be able to topple the power structure that they had at that point in time. But lastly, it's also funded by allied forces as well. Oftentimes, the British only left Malaya at that point in time because of the blitzkrieg attacks that the Japanese were able to have. That means to say they were still able to exert their influence in terms of supplying armies and being able to train their officers. These were well-trained militias that were able to counter the Japanese and conduct assassinations at that point in time to counter its power struggle then. The second layer to this just shows why the Japanese army is quite unpredictable in terms of this. The Japanese army regards little to the people that it occupies. The fact is that they took over their land, took over your resources, sent all of your people to the worst and harshest conditions of the land. How would they regard you as an individual who leaked the informant, somehow be an equal person when you're no longer Japanese and they try to impose their entire culture around you? It's abhorrent and naive for opposition to believe in that sentiment as well. But it's also the lack of a counteracting force. The Japanese army was the totalitarian rule. They were able to subvert the power of sultans and local rulers as well. The fact is that there was no one to challenge the rule of the Japanese. It's easy for you to be replaced by another individual so long as other people also step up and leak information against you to them. You are a pawn in the opposition and you will always be side with the proposition.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Speakers will be able to apply the vote right ending after 17. Now I'd like to invite your conversation. Thank you.
The unfortunate reality is that you as a civilian living in a village in the height of the Japanese occupation have very little potential to change the outcome of the war of World War II, the outcome of Japanese occupation in any meaningful way whatsoever, which means you ought to value yourself first, even if it means selling out your fellow villagers, even if it means giving information to the oppressors and cooperating with some of the most heinous people alive. Opposition stands for self-defense and self-preservation because your greatest duty is first and foremost towards yourself. Insofar as we can prove this, even if it is true that the MPAJA has some efficacy here, we think that you ought to prioritize yourself first, but we're also going to show as to why it is probably not likely that it's going to have a significant impact in the round. I want to talk about two things. The first is why you as a moral agent have the greatest duty to yourself. Second, in terms of which world are you best protected. Let's first talk about morality. This is important because the actor is also a moral agent that has principle to consider. Importantly as well, this is a non-consequentialist argument. So whether or not MPAJA could have made a difference or not, the onus is primarily to protect yourself, your parents, your family, and your friends, and to prioritize certain utility in the immediate term, which is the benefit that the Japs are offering. I'll take you later. There are three reasons as to why this is true. The first is general proximity. You are a lot closer towards yourself than to communities and the people that you are selling out. So this is just very simply self-defense. If I have to choose between, like Eon's like attacking me for some reason, I have to choose between my life or his, I will obviously choose mine because I'm more proximate towards myself and I value my life a lot more than I value the lives of others. Which just means I ought to prioritize utility that I can value, that like meaning of life that I can value, and that's just why this is important. Self-defense is also an acceptable defense for things like murder that is recognized in the status quo, but also if you consider the relative cost towards yourself, the cost for yourself of joining the MPAJA or just doing nothing is getting tortured, it's getting oppressed by the Japanese, right? So because you don't have a capacity to meaningfully change things, and because the cost to yourself is great, you ought to prioritize yourself and the utility that you gain later. The second is consent and reciprocity. There is no prior agreement between you and the community, and I'm not sure as to why you're such a strong brotherhood that's having dinner around the campfire in that side of the house. I think it's very likely, we're talking about the context of the Japanese occupation, there's very high tension, there's a lot of conflict surrounding the lack of resources. Moreover, if these communities involved in MPAJA, it probably results in greater scrutiny of the Japanese military in your specific village, which is all to say that the community is probably not as strong and not as not as connected as that side will make it out to be. All of which goes to show that you ought to value yourself over your community because you never consented to be part of that community, nor do you consent to the situation that you are in right now, as unfortunate as it may be. The third reason is that there's the first mover advantage here. It is very likely this offer was made towards others. You could be a victim should other people act first, and the Japanese instead choose to torture you mercilessly, or if you join MPAJA, even worse, they catch you and lock you up. Therefore, there's a first mover, you ought to take this now before someone else does. All of this needs to be weighed against skill, and I think the unfortunate reality is that you are going to sell out your friends and family. You are going to sell out the members of your community, and I'm very sorry to say that you probably will feel guilt about it, but it's more important for you to preserve your life, and at some point in the future you can heal from the damage towards yourself, and you can find meaning in the stories that you share towards others of how this war eventually turned out. At the end of this argument, we prove that your greatest duty is to yourself first and foremost, independent of any outcome of the other side. Yes?
You just spent 3 minutes on a non-response and a non-argument. Our first argument is not about principle, it's about what you believe in at that point in time. If your entire community told you that you should put your life on the line and everyone else did so, why would you counteract against the community that you have strong bonds and ties against?
Yeah, but that's the beauty about deontology, right? Your obligation says independent of your interest and independent of the context you are in. So even if you believe you should do this, you have a greater duty to yourself first, and that's what you ought to prioritize as an actor. Second argument, why is it the best move to protect yourself? What is the value that you offer to the Japanese if you consider informing them? I think as we see in the info slide, you have knowledge about the activities of MPAJA and like people who are helping them, right? If you inform your villagers and they get caught, this shows value to the Japanese, which also draws a distinction between the people in Nanjing, because those people were slaughtered because they didn't offer any utility and value towards the Japanese. That goes to show that you are likely to get things like food and shelter. Like, it's probably not going to be the best but at the very least, you're not going to be tortured, you're not going to be questioned, you're not going to be locked up without any cause because you're suspected to be an informant for MPAJA and other resistance groups. Have a seat. Like, your friends and your family are also going to be protected because this is likely to be necessary for the Japanese to secure your cooperation. Why is this likely? There are three reasons. The first is that the Japanese need information to counter encounter MPAJA and other resistance groups. Therefore, they're going to keep you around for the potential spy value that you have. And if it's true that you have to be a spy and continue selling out your villagers, that's probably what you ought to do, just because it's better protect yourself. But all this goes to show that the Japanese find value in you, and that's why they're going to protect and preserve your quality of life to some extent. The second reason why is because once you show loyalty, the culture of Japanese culture is basically to value loyalty to a large extent, especially within the Japanese military. No thank you. All of this shows that you add value to the Japanese army one time by informing on your friend, then the loyalty is something the Japanese consider and are likely to keep you around there. The third reason is because they want more cooperation, right? Obviously, if people are choosing between the oppressors and choosing between like resistance fighters, there is a strong community incentive to choose the resistance fighters, which is why the Japanese have to show it is valuable for you to prioritize the Japanese and inform on them. And if they don't treat you well, it is a huge disincentive for other people to spy and inform. No more POS, please. All of this shows it is incredibly likely for the Japanese to value you and to protect your quality of life to some extent. Auxiliary benefit here also, you get access to information, like might not be high level information, right? Low level information about where the barracks are, about their weapon strength, whether they have RPGs or tanks. I don't know if they have tanks that time or not. But the issue here, right, like, water or food supplies that they have, all of which could potentially become important down the road as a bargaining chip for you in the future. On the comparative, what happens when you join MPAJA? This is a guerrilla army pushing back against the Japanese, right? And it's also the reason why there's very high scrutiny on the village, why the Japanese are torturing people in that specific village as well. This demanding of resources that's already scarce. They're selective with medicine and welfare. All of this proves that MPAJA may not necessarily have popular support, despite what the government will have you believe. Or because the resources are scarce, the likelihood of conflict is going to be quite high, and therefore we think MPAJA is likely to cause some degree of dissent within the village. Why is this worse? One, the Japanese are very strong militarily. There's a very high chance you're going to be caught, you're going to be tortured. You're probably likely to be forced to fight, and you as a civilian don't have any military training, which means you're likely to be the first one on the field, the first one to be shot, and the first one to die. But even if you're not caught, life is terrible. You're the guerrilla, right? You have to constantly run from the Japanese. You don't know how your future is going to work. You might not even win the war at that point in time because you don't have access to information. You don't know if you can make a difference. This is incredibly likely because in the height of the Japanese occupation, after the British were pushed out, they used this policy of the scorched earth. So that's why I cannot say that the Brits are funding MPAJA because the Brits were pushed out, they burned all the oil fields and all the resources. They don't have the capacity to fund MPAJA. That's why the resources are likely to be incredibly scarce. But secondly, it's very hard to recruit because you were never a trained soldier, which means the manpower within MPAJA is likely to be small. You're constantly being caught, you're constantly being tortured. All of these are reasons as to why your life is likely to be worse off. On a certain utility, on moral proximity, on the community impact and access to information, all of these are reasons why you ought to value yourself. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now I'd like to invite Deputy Prime Minister right here.
Everywhere you look, you see a childhood friend that you grew up with get strangled to death by the individuals that composed of your nightmares. When you close your eyes, you heard the screams and the cries of your sibling or your mother getting kicked to the ground by the individuals that were laughing around them, surrounding them. Every second you live is a reminder that in this state that you currently live in, you are no longer human in the eyes of your oppressors. So how on earth does this opposition expect us to immediately disregard and so willingly choose to abandon the individuals that we live with, grew up with, that love us the most for the sake of the individuals that claim that they have sought out to kill us? For the sake of the individuals that we fought for the sake of the individuals that we grew up with, we do not believe the opposition's disregarding strategy to just say that you have to value your life over the other individuals that made that life worth living was particularly important. I want to make a few things clear at the top of this speech, because the claim on the opposition was to say that because of the fact that you are a human being and the fact that you don't want to live just means to say that you probably should prioritize your own life, and you should prioritize prioritize their own survivability over whatever principle the Gov has to give. The extent of this analysis, to be fairly honest, was very circular and very non-contentious. They just told you, if you don't help the Japanese are going to kill you, you're going to die, and dying is not good. But to be fairly honest, that particular extent of the analysis was contingent upon plenty of premises that we're going to engage with further down my speech. But what I will say for now is that at this point in time, they're not proving anything. Because sure, you're going to die, but they don't prove that the inherent, but they don't prove specifically what exactly makes this particular life that you're having at the current moment so incredibly important towards you at this point in time. We give you two far more comparative forms of weighing that told you why at this point in time the principle probably outweighs your own life and survivability in the context of this debate. Firstly, we told you that it's unclear as to, that at this point in time, under the context that you're living in, the MPAJA is also probably very important within your community. But during the times of Japanese occupation, it was a consensus among every single Malaysian citizen that they hated the fact that Japanese were oppressing them, and they hated the fact that the Japanese were occupying their lands. Every single individual that you mix with, every person that you talk to, every person that you were surrounded by was telling you that the Japanese are terrible oppressors, and the individuals that killed your mother, the individuals that killed your siblings, those were the people that were taking upon our lands. So in the point in which in which the vast majority of your life, or in the vast majority of this occupancy, you were fed the information to say, these are the people we should fight against. These are the people we should lay down our lives against, because the millions of other individuals that they have targeted, that they have killed, that they have actively taken away from our lives have died for a reason. It was the reason, and that reason was for us to actively take a stand against them. That was the point in which this was probably the far more important principle embedded into your head. Rather than laying down your life for this particular situation, you made this a priority for you to stand by in your head. But secondly, we told you that in this context of this war, life was very much suffering at this point in time. You were always under constant threat of death, and you were always under constant threat of having your life being taken away from you, which also meant to say at this point in time, the question wasn't whether or not you would get killed or whether you would lose your life, but rather the fact that you had individuals to latch onto and derive meaning from that particular life, and to have hope for the sake of these individuals. You continued living because you wanted to experience more experiences with these individuals. You wanted to be there for them. You wanted to support your siblings that were currently living in fear of the Japanese government. Those were the individuals that you wanted to continue living for. So that means that you wanted to continue living for, and those are the individuals that you cared for the most. So at the forefront of your mind, the decision-making rationale that you have isn't, am I going to live as an individual? It is whether or not I can do the most to help my family, to help my friends, and to eventually stick the best with my community. At the point at which you betrayed that principle, you made the very source of the meaning of that life completely dispensable. You traded off any reason for why you had to live that life at all. You may as well be dead on the side of opposition. For those reasons, we don't think that you are able to just disregard this principle entirely. They were very non-engaging. You have to deal with that for the DLO. Go.
Yeah, so you are a civilian, you're not military trained. How do you help the MPAJA in a way that's meaningful to your life?
Similarly, you are a civilian, you're not military trained. How do you give valuable information to the Japanese government without being found out? You're not trained in the ways of espionage, you're not trained in the ways of actually being discreet, or you're not actually trained in the idea that you're not going to be found out by the MPAJA. So in the case where you get found out, then you are completely screwed over. The individuals that you want to live with completely ostracize you, and that's the very worst case on the side of the opposition that we still have yet to deal with. I meant to bring this up later on, but it seemed like a good opportunity to at the current moment. Okay, cool. Next thing, we're also going to use the rhetoric of the opposition as well, because they told you we're not just ratting out our friends and family to some rando on the street. We have an obligation to ourselves. That means to say that as long as you're continuing to rat these people out and you're continuing to give information to the Japanese, you're giving information to the individuals that pose a current threat against you. These were the people who told you that if you don't give us information, you will be next. Your life will be taken away from you. So whenever you helped them, and whenever you told, and every time you gave them a piece of information to help them on their cause, you were supporting the individuals that aim to take away your life. And that was an inherent principle that you would never be able to take away your mind from, because every moment that you lived to help the Japanese was a moment that you betrayed your very self instead. But finally, to be very, very dynamic here, let's talk about security. Whether or not your life will actually be far better under the Japanese rule. And this is us being extremely dynamic, trying to engage with them on their own metric. We gave you two claims from Prime Minister to tell you why exactly they lost on that front. Firstly, you need to remember that what the Japanese tell you that you will get is no more than a promise. They haven't shown you that house, they haven't shown you that money, they haven't shown you that wealth that they're going to get. At this point in time, the only thing you have to rely upon to ensure that you will live under the Japanese rule is their word. The word of the individuals that have oppressed your people for this long. The words of the individuals that raped your mother and that killed the individual, that killed the siblings that you live with. For all those reasons, if both sides agree that the Japanese were truly so heinous and were truly morally harmful individuals, how on earth could we trust them to give them the resources they say that they will give to us? LO tells us that the Japanese will probably have an incentive to give us resources for now because they have no incentive like for other individuals to continue spying for them. But what happens when you do finish spying for them? After the Japanese completely exterminate MPAJA, after the Japanese, in their very best case, do actually succeed in the war, you are no more than a pawn that has been used up and completely fulfilled your purpose. What use do they have of you then? At the best case that they have, the security that you get is completely short-term, completely circumstantial. The very best case of the opposition was to say that maybe the Japanese will give you food for the time being, but once you use up your purpose, when they have no use for you, you are gone, they will kill you immediately. But finally, in the very, very best case of these individuals, in the very, very best case, even if the Japanese wins and even if they let you live, we told you why this particular life that you lead will be completely not worth living. Because these are times when you're going to have to live as a second-hand individual. These are times when the Japanese are not going to lift an arm to help you if you ever hate crime in a world that was led by the Japanese. So that means to say that completely down the life, you're going to be living, sure, but it will be a life full of suffering, life full of fear, because the Japanese individuals that occupy the lands are going to completely hate you for the rest of your life. You live a life of suffering, it will prefer to die a quick death standing by the people that you love. Go for the autograph.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech. Now let me invite Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Can I share the panels ready? Good? Alright, cool. I think that the problem with the government bench at this point in time is that they have essentially based the entire case of false characterizations of the power of the MPAJA, the amount of community support they have, the amount of outreach they have. Because although it is true that people didn't, of course, oppose the Japanese, the comparative of wanting or people pushing you to join the MPAJA was probably slight. The fact is, the British had a scorched earth policy, which meant that they did not provide that many weapons to the MPAJA. They didn't provide that much training to the MPAJA. The fact is, they were an unsuccessful guerrilla movement for a reason, right? The reality is, the reason why Japan eventually gave up was because of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not at all because of the MPAJA. At most, they were an irritation to the people that were oppressing you. The end consequence of this analysis is that it picks out a whole bunch of framing and characterization on their side. When they tell you, for instance, that people have been pushing you so far to join this organization, odds are you might not even have that much information about this organization, what they do, the amount of community support that they actually get. In fact, a lot of people likely oppose this group, and I'll talk about that later as well. Two questions therefore. Firstly, which is actually better for you and your survival, and I'll also integrate individuals around you as well and we help protect them. And secondly, which is better for the war effort as a whole. Firstly, you and your survival. Government bench tells you that there are people pushing you to join the MPAJA because generally speaking, it was generally considered super important. Couple of responses. Firstly, that's not true. If it were, way more people would have actually joined. The reality is that they were a tiny guerrilla movement for a reason. No, thank you. They had very, very little actual community support. They had very little weapons and very little manpower. That's why they waged a guerrilla war, not an actual rebellion, right? The end consequence of this is that these are probably small bands of guerrillas operating in the woods. There are 20 of them per village, village or small town at most. The end consequence of that is probably didn't have that much community support. But notice that this argument is uncomparative. For every whisper of the MPAJA you get, you have a corpse of the MPAJA hanging above your door. You have physical, visceral examples of what it is like if you join them. You have family members of MPAJA people being tortured because the Japanese want to make them an example, right? All of this proves that we are probably terrified of actually being caught with these individuals as well. The end consequence of this, no thank you, is that the odds of you actually joining them and benefiting people is slight. What did we tell you? We tell you that you'll likely be caught. The reality is that it's a balance of probability, right? What are the odds of you being caught by your community versus the Japanese army? And there are a couple of reasons why the Japanese army is more likely to catch you. The first is simply the fact that they have more telecommunications networks and information, right? The fact is they had control of the radio waves at the time. They had control of important centers of power. They have more spies around because they're literally an imperial army. The consequence of this is that the end impacts of your community catching you spying, you're a spy, so you're not telling everyone you're a spy, lah, bodoh. Like, the reality is that the reality of that community condemnation is probably fairly slight, right? Versus the odds of the Japanese catching you and then killing you as a result. Note the comparative, right? Community condemnation versus death. Death is probably worse, but it's not just death for you, right? The Japanese are not moderate people like that. They'll probably kill you and your family as well, and every other person who's vaguely related to you. So those people you grew up with, they die in your world, no thank you, because the balanced probability is the Japanese will catch you, not the MPJA, who has got little resources and ability to actually catch Japanese spies. Like half the buggers in there will probably be actually Japanese spies, right? The reality is that the odds of you being caught are far slimmer in their world. But note that you also get avoidance of torture and avoidance of pain. So for instance, the Japanese are likely to smuggle you things like medicine, for instance, if your family is sick, as a reward for you cooperating with them in the here and now. They're likely to be slighter, no thank you, they're likely to deliberately try to find ways to avoid torturing you or avoid capturing your family. For instance, of suspicion, because they know that you are providing them with information about who actually is a spy. The reality is that with more uncertainty comes more likelihood that the people you know interact with are going to be hit. So don't let Gelson's short story about the teammates being the ones who are being caught will happen. Probably the comparative is not between me and TJ, it's probably between me, TJ, and the uncle who sells me roti canai down the street, right? So we probably have to sacrifice that uncle rather than an individual directly around us as a result. Second question, so like, the idea that the Japanese will get rid of you and you're a pawn, no thank you. So like, notice that they just have absolutely no, like they told you that generally speaking, the Japanese will not value you after the war is over because they don't value your ability to continue cooperating. What if they one day beat the MPAJA? Like, logically speaking, cooperation is cooperation, right? They want to make a positive example of cooperation, whether it's military cooperation or not. So the end consequence of that is that they're probably likely going to value you and not torture you or kill you or continue threatening you for the very simple reason that they want to make an example to other people. But notice, there is no endpoint at which the Japanese are certain that you have no more information left to give or you're no longer useful as a cooperative person. So thank you. The end consequence of that is probably you are likely to be able to have some utility to the Japanese, even if they're not even if it's not cooperation, in other areas of life as well. So for example, in economic activities, etc. Now notice that there's no engagement with TJ's second reason why the Japanese would want you, because of the idea of cultural loyalty, right? Culture is an important argument here, because we're literally talking about the Japanese army, the one of the most, no thank you, one of the communities that value loyalty the most. It's upwards loyalty from the downward up, but also from the upward down. If someone cooperates with you, culturally, you take good care of them. Yeah.
So if your Japanese army is that totalitarian, they're having developed spy system, then that's attention for the need for you to actually set a positive example. Why would they fulfill the promises for a second-rate citizen when you can just run propaganda and say everyone is live while in the other side of the house?
Like generally speaking, they have the ability to have information about individual spies and individuals who are likely cooperating with the MPJA. But they still need more individuals as a result, or they need more individuals who are around to help you. But furthermore, the value that you provide to the Japanese is probably significantly higher because they can train you and help you as a result. But notice that this analysis was given by TJ, right? Like at this point, if you don't take this deal, someone else then will, and then spy on you as a result. So at this point, you're probably going to be making that calculus as a result. The last thing that I want to engage you on the discussion, the idea that life is not worth living anymore. That's just absurd. Like life is always worth living. That's why people in the Holocaust and people who are in death camps who are desperately struggling to escape, or even if it risks them getting beaten, life is always worth living. Like don't let Gelson tell you that, and don't let anyone tell you that. Life is great. All right. Second issue, therefore, which is better for your community? Notice that the entire crux of the opposition government case at this point in time is that by writing out the MPJA, you help your community resist the Japanese. But no, that doesn't engage with the material in TJ about how the MPAJA hurts your community. How so? It is because of the fact that the MPAJA is there that the Japanese have to actually monitor everyone so securely, right? It's the fact that they are there that they have to capture people, execute them randomly, and torture them. The reality is that the threat of the MPAJA worsens the totalitarian nature of the Japanese to a point of being worse and more intolerable to people. You have to deprive them of food and medicine to avoid them having access to give to the MPAJA. The reality is that if you actually write them out and get them out of your community, you're probably helping your community as a whole by making life under the Japanese worse. The end impact of this, material in TJ is it actually flips every single one of their benefits. If they tell you that you're selling out the community for yourself, you're not. You're hurting them by ensuring that the Japanese have to continually torture people, kill people, etc. to avoid a further rebellion in the future. The end impact of that is that none of their material stands and we flipped it all so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now I'd like to invite Government to give it.
I think opposition approached this debate in a very peculiar way. Because at the end of their first argument, the ultimate conclusion to all of those analyses is just that you might have, on some abstract and obligatory philosophical level, a justification of you self-prioritizing on the side of opposition. But ultimately, we already pointed out that that did not deal with the heart of this debate, and it did not deal with the crux of our first argument. This debate was not about what you had an obligation towards. And I don't think they mechanized it enough to say that it was your highest interest just because of those philosophical or deontological reasons. We explained that your community, the people that you grew up with, your brothers and your sisters, and the people, even if the person was selling you roti canai, if you loved the roti canai, it was something that you would likely care far more about than your deontological purposes inside of opposition. Which is why at the end of the day, this debate couldn't be adjudicated based on principal obligations, but rather what the real actor in the context of this motion was likely to feel. That is why we have to take this debate on the side of proposition. But I'm going to examine their case in a few key respects. The first thing I want to point out is just the idea of the MPAJA lacking funding on our side of the house. I think ultimately, this was a rebuttal that they repeated in all two of their speeches, but I don't think it was very impactful at the end of the day. Because if you don't have funding, that doesn't necessarily explain why you wouldn't care about this, right? You didn't have to be successful because none of our practical arguments were contingent upon your success in this debate. But let's deal with their argument in a few key respects. The first thing they say is that the British have a scorched earth policy, so they're not going to be funding the MPAJA. In fact, it was the reality that the British did in fact fund the MPAJA, but the reason why we already explained is because, sure, they might have the incentive to, quell Malayan independence, but you know what else they had an incentive to do? They had an incentive to stop the Japanese from taking a full control over the region of the Malayan Peninsula, because they also had vested interest in that, and the fact that the Japanese were occupying these regions meant it was incredibly unlikely that they were able to maintain trade relationships if the Japanese took full control and eliminated all insurgent groups. That is the competing narrative that explains why the British was still likely to fund them on the side of proposition. But that wasn't really what was important in this debate. The second thing they said is that the Japanese are far superior in terms of military strategy. They have more tanks and they have more spies. I want to note something very important at the end of this. When second opposition says that, oh, the Japanese probably has even more information, right? They have thousands of other spies. Half of these people in the Malayan and your brothers and sisters are also probably spies, so there's no point in this one person. So even if you have funding on us as the house, that Japan is still better than MPAJA. This essentially contradicts their case, because if they have thousands of spies, then what use is this one person on the side of proposition giving away this information or turning them down? They never proved why that was a tipping point for the Japanese going into these villages and raising like the villages and shooting everybody as a result of this decision of one person. If they had thousands of spies, it didn't matter if one person did it on the side of proposition. Ultimately, we do not think it is the case that this information or this person was particularly special at the end of the day. This was the average civilian, the Malayan citizen at the end of the day, which is why we explain the interests of your community and the people you grew up with were far more proximate to your interests as an actor. The last thing that they say is that the Japanese value loyalty. And this is what I'm going to talk about in this first issue, which is what exactly the Japanese were likely to think in this regard. Because for all of the analysis that our opposition gives to you, they don't actually explain the incentives of the Japanese, right? But before that, actually, I want to take a pew.
The British scorched earth policy and the distance from Malaya doesn't show they don't have an incentive to help. It shows they lack capacity, which means you're more likely to be caught, you're more likely to suffer and not have food, security, and medicine.
I think again, this PI misses the point of our case, which is that regardless of how much protecting or security you had, the MPAJA fought for a common message that was far more empowering for you as the average Malayan citizen than any comparative on the side of opposition when you sold your soul to the Japanese and you ratted out your fellow man. So what did opposition never respond to in all two of their speeches, and it is far too late in opposition with? That the Japanese were in fact untrustworthy actors, that we could not trust them, that these were individuals that entered the Malayan Peninsula and forcefully occupied these regions and claimed it as their own when there were groups of individuals that were already in there and engaged in sovereignty. Firstly, this is important because the Japanese, in the context of this debate, were embroiled in an active armed conflict against your people, right? So it wasn't as if they saw you as another Japanese person or a future Japanese citizen. You were an enemy combatant that just so happened to be useful because you contain a specific amount of information. And this is an important thing I want to point out, right? How would you have got this information in either side of the house? It was likely, given that this is not public information and the Japanese doesn't know and they have a bunch of spies somehow, right? It is likely that you were told this in confidence, which is the reason why the vast majority of the times when you give this information to the Japanese and the people find out, the blame is going to be pinned on you by the person who told you that in confidence. That is why they're able to tie it specifically to you as an individual. But secondly, their existence, the Japanese's existence and hold over power contradicts your rights in this debate and contradicts your liberties, which is why the Japanese forfeited the word and their claim towards prioritizing, being trustworthy, the moment in which their soldiers raged through your villages and deprived you of your sovereignty. The implication of this untrustworthiness on the ground is that their practical outcomes, in the best case that they assume this is going to happen, is in fact highly dubious. They say the Japanese are going to offer you shelter, they say they're going to give you food, they're going to give you protection, but at the end of the day, how much control do you have over that outcome? If the Japanese doesn't give you shelter, if they don't give you food, what are you going to do? You have already given this information, you have already forfeited the one thing that you had and a relationship and as a tool in this debate, as a tool in this conflict to the Japanese. You don't have any chokehold in that power. Ultimately, the power imbalance in this debate is what is going to lose them that practical clash. But what was their response? They say, oh, actually the Japanese become more brutal the less they have. Actually, they didn't really say this, but they said it in a POI, and I think it's quite interesting, right? But what exactly was their reasoning in this claim? Oh, they said we said that they were brutal. So on that side of the house, the less information they have, the more brutal they were going to be. But the thing you want to note here is that if all it took was one person turning down the Japanese for turning down the Japanese decision and this offer, for them to just start killing everybody indiscriminately, I think on either side of the house, your life is screwed. You're not going to survive this war, guys. If the Japanese are so brutal that they're going to kill a person as soon as they don't give them the information that they want, regardless of what sort of good faith or contract you make with them, they're going to kill you regardless. And at the end of the day, we prefer on the side of proposition. Secondly, they said that the Japanese have a strong incentive to care about you, but only insofar as you provide value. That was exactly the problem, which is why on our world, the MPAJA number one doesn't need you to be a soldier, right? So if you weren't fit to be a soldier, I think Yang Ling's setup made it very clear that you could contribute in other ways. You become a teacher, for instance, you could spread the message, and you could help people and deliver food aid to people who you care about in these places. That was Gelton's argument that they didn't engage with, that you are valuable as a result of your decision intrinsically to deprioritize your selfish interests and to care about the wider community in general. But more importantly, if the Japanese only care about you because you have utility, the point at which you stop providing utility is the point at which they no longer have an incentive to care about you. If you don't have any more information, the Japanese have no utility in keeping you alive. That is why you're going to die far easier on the side of opposition. So at the end of this debate, have they proved their positive comparative? We think the answer is no. If it is true that the Japanese will accept you in with open arms and open hearts on the side of opposition, we don't think they have mechanized that to a significant extent. But your value on the side of proposition was derived from your contribution to your community. If on both sides of the house, your life was short-lived, this was a terrible conflict, this was a massive war, on side of the proposition, your life contributed to the liberation of the Malayan people, and that was a principle that you prioritize over all else, which is why we're incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Gabri, for that speech. To end the substantive part of the debate, I'd like to invite opposition to appear here.
The frame here that I think was never really engaged with is that your community is fucked anyways, right? That either side's world doesn't really seem really much worth living. Either your community is pissed at you for all the things you have done and you're a heathen, or like you join a rebellion where you're constantly reminded that you have seen multiple bodies hung across your door, that if you do get caught, your loved ones die, that if you do get caught, you are directly complicit in the reasons why your loved ones die, that if you do get caught, unfortunately, you are the reason why the roti canai uncle down the street who never consented into this relationship, or like the fact that like your mother and your parents never really consented into this probably dies. The issue here is that if on either side of the house, that like your community is screwed anyways, who proved the better benefit and who proved the more reified benefit? The answer is very simple, ours. Because on the other side of the house, the main thing they couch their entire case upon is the fact that there's no accountability or you're directly complicit. The main thing to point out is that the flip side can also be true. You can also be directly complicit in the massacre of your village. You can also be directly complicit in terms of like the ability for you to fight back. You're directly complicit as well in the people who never consented into this. Therefore, you can also be morally as heinous because your ability to join them has led to not only zero net utilitarian outcome as you're proven to you from first, but also zero principal outcome because the principal outcome is contingent on you winning, right? Therefore, very simply put, there's two questions in this debate. The first is, how is the MPAJA actualized? The second is, will the Japanese give you concessions? Let's start with the former. How has the MPAJA actualized? The average person is probably like, like not very favorable to the MPAJA, anyways, or like decently like partially of like whatever vibe, like pretty like not very vibey, right? There's three reasons we gave you from first. The first is that like very simply the messaging was extremely clear from and this came on Ian as well, right? But like if you see hung body on your door, the messaging is very clear. You are probably and you as an MPAJA individual probably will get killed. Number two, like there's a higher amount of scrutiny. So from the time when TJ was responded to, is that there's a much higher level of scrutiny insofar as they know there's an MPAJA informant there, right? The reason why your information is so important is because probably there's a high level of MPAJA activity there. Therefore, that's why they're asking you for informants, right? Therefore, the impact of this is very simple. Is that you as an individual might not be the most sympathetic towards the MPAJA either, because number one, there are the reasons why like your area is being targeted to begin with. Number two, this negates the efficacy of MPAJA because they're not that benevolent. Anyways, but cool. What does this mean, right? This means that what is equally unlikely, what this essentially means is that I don't necessarily think there's going to be a principal backlash. The second question, therefore, is the second question, therefore, is like what specifically is like going to be the counterfactual in terms of like hope? Because they were like, but hope. Hope relies on also some level of certainty. What is equally unlikely is also like winning the Japanese, right? So if on both sides of the house, the hope is contingent on also some level of actualizability of that hope, I'm not sure why you joining the Japanese, why you joining like MPAJA, right? It's going to be significantly more hope or give you significantly more hope. Because again, if you okay, and this is when I move on to my last clash, right? Would the Japanese give you concessions is the biggest clash within this debate. If I win this, it also proves that like their claim that like these individuals are not going to give you food and water doesn't stand. But number two, it also shows a much clearer comparative versus the very like vague but like complicity, right? But before I move on, yes.
Your case is contingent upon the Japanese finding it very hard to find this information so that you as a specific individual are important. But if it's the case that the MPAJA are so underfunded, how would the Japanese, how is it the case that they're able to hide this so effectively from the Japanese?
No, so like the MPAJA is like really like it's like the MPAJA is able to have a system of surveillance because they have a system of compliance. If like they don't reward one MPAJA person, or if they kill off that one MPAJA person, there's no reason why any informants want to rat anyone else out in the first place. Therefore, their entire system of surveillance collapses, right? Therefore, it's not a whether of like they are funded or underfunded. It's the fact that if they rat out somebody and they don't reward another person, then the entire system collapses anyways. You get no more surveillance. That is why they have a full incentive to do so anyways. Very nicely put into why specifically they want to keep you alive, right? So like, yes, that's number one. Number two, if the Japanese number two, your contribution to these individuals also allows for the crackdown on information. It is a lie to say that you joining the MPAJA has the same impact or strategic impact as you joining like the Japanese. Because you joining the MPAJA is joining an extremely underfunded, really screwed up like guerrilla area, right? The counterfactual, therefore, is that because like on your contribution of this information allows for like the increased reduction of like things like MPAJA activity, allows for the increase in terms of the ability for them to crack down on MPAJA individuals. You must realize, panel, that there's a very different impact here, right? If you join MPAJA, there's no much significant increase in terms of their ability to succeed against Malaysia, against the Japanese, right? But if you join the Japanese have a significantly much higher ability for you to crack down on MPAJA individuals. Why is this important? Because the false dichotomy here that they say, but the information is not that valuable anyways, is false, right? And it's demonstrably so, because if it is indeed not as effective, their side is even less effective in terms of achieving their end goals of independence. Therefore, in terms of a practical outcome, we show to you that that is one of the main ways in which that is to say that that's the main reason why specifically on our side of the house the Japanese are willing to give you concessions. No. What is the counterfactual, therefore? With all the characterizations of increased levels of surveillance, two things change. Number one, joining MPAJA is something that will probably get you caught. Number two, on the flip side, the damage is not just localized to you. The damage is like spread apart, right? That's why the entire Ian, like an extension of like the roti canai, for example, is so important because nobody will know, right? But like nobody, yeah, it's like conversely enough, right? Even if it's true that to some degree you have some level of shame, the shame is also contained as a result, right? Because like I guess your family and some level of your village would like know that you're a Japanese informant, but not like the rest of Malaysia, right? Especially if you want to like use the characterization of the fact that like Malaysia is like really horrible, like it's like really big. I suppose it is like one Singapore it's like very small, Malaysia very big, right? Like the rest of Malaysia won't know. Your community, like the max is like localized to your community versus like your entire community getting wiped out, right? So what are the harms that we talk to you about? If you do get caught, everyone you love dies. So if it's true, I'm so sorry, right? But like, it's very sad, right? If you live on and then you come back to your village, right? And then you see like your whole family die because they realize that you were informant, right? So like the other side, our counterfactual is not that good either when it comes to like the ability to live, right? Because if everyone else you love dies, there's no point in living anyways, right? If this is true, right, and you do get caught, and we prove to you why you do get caught, then the other side of the house doesn't fulfill their moral obligation because their moral obligation is couched in the fact that you don't get caught, right? Therefore, you are going to get blamed for all of this, or that because of the repercussions of that, but also of the fact that in terms of moral culpability, you are the reason why your entire family dies. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech. To begin the reply segment of the debate, I'd like to firstly invite Opposition Reply.
So let's be clear. In order to buy the Gov Bench's case, you need to believe two things. And both of them have to be true if you want to ever consider giving them the win. The first is that joining the MPAJA tangibly helps your community rather than hurts it, right? So it prevents more deaths rather than causes more deaths to your community. The second thing is that the deaths that you would cause from joining the MPAJA are worth risking the lives of those immediately around you. And the balance of probabilities are such that you will not be caught, or that if you are caught, it's worth it. My speech will illustrate to you basically how our case answers both of these by undercutting both of these premises and therefore taking them out of the debate. Let's do the first one first. Whether or not you as an individual are likely to reasonably lead towards an increase of benefit for your community or worsening your community. Note that we already gave you analysis about how the Japanese are far more likely to crack down on your community far harder the point in which they suspect that the MPAJA is operating in that area. That is to say, you, right? This means that if they have uncertain information, and this was the POI I raised to first and carried out throughout our speeches, they are far more likely to arbitrarily kill and rape and plunder and arrest individuals, including maybe your family, but also those random people on the street that you meet on a day-to-day basis. The end consequence of that is that probably once you don't join the MPAJA, once you actually either A, join as an informant and rat them out so that they might even be removed from your community, or join them as an informant and give the Japanese information about who to kill and not to kill so that they actually go after the people they need to kill, you're probably actually on a net decreasing the amount of harm to your community as a whole. And note that at this point in time, the Gov Bench's case is contingent on this trade-off, right? The community over yourself, over your individual, that principle stance that they're so willing to fight about, right? All of that principle stance goes out the window, the point in which you realize that joining the MPAJA hurts your community rather than helps it. But let's talk about the trade-off. Let's assume that joining the MPAJA helps the community as a whole. Why then do we actually prove to you that that trade-off is not worth it? The first thing that we tell you is that the Japanese, we give you carrot and stick situation, right? You probably are going to get access to medicine and help if you help the Japanese. And if you don't help the Japanese and you're caught and you join the MPAJA, you get killed and your family will get killed. They attack the carrot. Notice that they didn't really attack the stick, right? Like at this point, like, let's deal with both of these things. Firstly, the carrot, right? We tell you that there are positive incentives for you to help, medicine, etc. They tell you that that if they were true, you cannot trust them because they've done bad things to you. Like, notice there's a logical non sequitur, right? That analysis does not take out our analysis about how, yes, they might have done bad things to you, but they also need you in that circumstance, or they likely require you to increase cooperation from you. And note that the third speaker goes up and says, there's a contradiction, because if they have other spies, then they don't really need you as a result. But Waiter then goes and answers that contradiction quite well, I think, in their speech, when they tell you that, look, if you go and deprive that spy of medicine and that reward, even if you have other spies, the other spies then turn on you, the point in which you're not guaranteeing them that protection, etc. So the Japanese kill one of their spies, assuming they have other spies, the entire spy network collapses or is far more less likely to cooperate with Japanese as well. The impact of that is therefore, they have a reasonable need of you as a person. The carrot in this debate stands, and that carrot is your family not getting tortured. But let's talk about the stake, because they didn't talk about the stake, right? The stake in this debate is your family you likely getting found out. The reality is that comparatively, the Japanese are far more likely to detect you than the MPAJA or your community ever are. The reality is that they are the ones with large amounts of control over centers of power. They are the ones with radio telecommunications that can actually transmit information to and fro far more quickly. The reality is that this translates into them being more likely to have more information about you, your whereabouts, and the whereabouts of spies, and therefore catching you. The end impact of them catching you is killing you, torturing you, but not just you, your family. The reason why this is more valuable than the random people that we heard on their side is because you have a unique obligation to yourself established in TJ that they just kind of waffle around in this debate. But beyond that, you have an obligation to those immediately around you because they didn't consent to being around you. So you literally gave birth to that child, for example, or your parents are your parents. You have a far stronger obligation to your family than the random people outside that you briefly interact with. So that's to say, we beat them on community in terms of wider community, we beat them in terms of direct community, and we beat them in terms of you. Vote for opposition. Thank you.
Thank you all for replying for that speech. Back to the debate, I'd like to invite Prof. to reply.
If the opposition supported life over all else, if they told you that the people around you are probably liars like yourself, and that the world that you live in was one comprised of a lack of morals and liars, then it was liars that told you that they will give you food and shelter as you ratted out the people you live with as you continue to spy on them. To this speech, the fundamental basics of the opposition's case has never been proven. Can you actually get security, or were you just being lied to the entire time? That was the claim that we raised for the start of the proposition case that never actually went engaged with. You have to give us the win. There are two things I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, on the principle versus practical clash, but secondly, on security, to be dynamic. The first was whether or not the principle was more important than your life. Because notice that the claim on their side remained extremely circular down the opposition bench. The only extent of analysis that they told you to say that life was good was to assert that life is good and bring up whatever roti canai, like uncle analogy that they had in their speeches. We told you why it compared towards our side. The environment that you live in consists of constant propaganda that told you that you should be laying your life down for these individuals that grew up with you. So chances are the mentality that you have at this point in time was to preserve your principles over that of your life. On an analytical standpoint, we completely trumped over the opposition in this case. But secondly, the completely unengaged material was still standing in terms of the life that you live, because it wasn't just rhetoric and storytelling. It was three structural layers for why exactly the life that you live will continue to be a long one, but it would be a long life of suffering and something that we would prefer to avoid altogether. Because firstly, you had to live knowing that you supported your oppressor, because understanding that they also want to have a moral obligation to yourself, that meant to say that the individuals that you know you're supporting are also individuals who said that they're gonna kill you if you didn't do what they said. So that also means that in any other universe, these were the threats to your life that you actively support. In any other universe, they would kill you, and therefore these are the individuals that you have to live knowing that you actively helped. But secondly, these are people that you have to know that you have to live knowing that you lied to your entire life. It's not some random harm that we told you out of rhetoric. This is knowing that every single interaction that you have was non-genuine and that you would never be able to experience true genuine happiness or relationships ever again. The people that you live with are going to be individuals who they were comprised of falsehoods. These were people knowing that you were a terrible person. But finally, you lived knowing that you were the one that provided the Japanese with the information to conduct that Japanese raid on the village, that conducted burning your village down and that killed your mother. Which is why every single comparative on their side from the whip onwards to tell you that you still have to see your family members die on our side was made even worse on the opposition. Because maybe we would have to see other individuals still die at the hands of the Japanese, but on their side, you were the person that was responsible for those people having died on your side. You were the individuals that gave the information towards the Japanese to conduct those heinous acts, which is why it's far worse on their side. Notice the comparative never actually actually engage with the crux of the government case, because our case was not dependent or not contingent upon us being able to beat the Japanese. Our case told you that because of everything else you've lived for, every person that you would die for, whether or not we can beat the Japanese, you were a completely despicable and terrible person that should not be permitted to live at all. But finally, in terms of security, and here's the best case that we told you, because aside from all the other argumentation that we gave to you, maybe you do not what if you don't buy all the analysis that we gave to you while only being a temporary pawn? What if you didn't buy all the analysis that we gave to you about the Japanese just lying to you and not giving you security? In the very best case where the Japanese do win, we were the only team that managed to engage with them on that front, because you still have to talk about the process leading up to that point, and the process afterwards was a life completely not worth living. Not only do you have to lie, you have to see the Japanese kill your mother, and you've had to see the Japanese kill the people you live around in that process. You live a life full of trauma, but not only that, you live a life as a second-class citizen in a Japanese oppressive state, where every single time you walked on the street, you had a chance of being hate crime, and the Japanese would not lift a finger to actually help you. The life you lived was a life full of suffering, but it also meant to say that in the very worst case, maybe they did kill us on our side, we would much rather have died a quick death, knowing we were able to hold the hands of our family members, knowing we were able to die a good person compared towards like dying a snitch. It was worse on their side because you would live a long life. It was a life of suffering. It was worse on their side because the individuals that killed you was not the Japanese, but it was themselves. That was the case of the opposition you have to propose.